Most people believe that finding an affordable apartment downtown is a stroke of luck, a gift from the universe. But what if this gift comes wrapped in too much silence, with walls that hold secrets and doors that open by themselves in the middle of the night? Tiffany just wanted a fresh start. Like millions of people, she dreamed of independence, stability, and peace. And when she found that tempting ad with a below-average price, excellent location, and peaceful atmosphere, she didn't think twice. What she didn't realize was that the real price wasn't in the contract, but in what she couldn't see. Many people still think stories like this are exaggerations, urban legends, internet fabrications. But what Tiffany experienced was as real as the breathing she heard near her ear at 3 in the morning. And the most disturbing thing, it wasn't ghosts like in horror movies. What she found was much more frightening because it was human, intelligent, cold, planned. Sometimes the true horror lies not in what is dead, but in what hides behind smiles and brightly painted walls. When she discovered what was happening in that apartment, it was like opening a collective wound, a scar hidden from society. In this video, you'll understand why certain places seem too good to be true, and how silence can be the cruelest hiding place for evil. We'll explore a story that blends courage, mystery, resilience, and a revelation capable of turning everything upside down. Prepare yourself for a journey of understanding, emotional intelligence, and above all, inspiration. Because Tiffany could be any one of us. What if she were you? Would you have stayed or run before hearing the first voice in the darkness? On that cloudy Monday morning, Tiffany held in her hands what seemed like the golden ticket to her freedom. The key to an apartment downtown. The building was old, steeped in history and charm, but it also exuded a strange silence, the kind that comes not only from the absence of sound, but from the absence of presence. She had fought tooth and nail to achieve this. She sold furniture, saved every penny, spent sleepless nights amid spreadsheets, job interviews, and anxiety attacks. This was her chance to start over, to take the step she'd always dreamed of. Hope throbbed in her chest like a drum, and in that moment, neither fear nor insecurity had any place. The walls of that small space seemed to embrace her with affection. It was as if the universe had finally smiled at her, as if courage and perseverance had found their reward. It was an act of self-love, of emotional intelligence, of overcoming obstacles. And although the apartment was dusty, with the typical smell of a place closed for too long, Tiffany felt she could flourish there. There was in those walls a promise of a new beginning, of resilience. However, on that very first night, something subtle shattered the stillness. It wasn't just the sounds of the city, nor the footsteps of neighbors upstairs. It was a deeper, more intimate noise, as if the apartment itself were breathing. A creak in the hallway floorboards, a dry click on the doorknob she'd just locked. The subtle whisper of something dragging along the wall. Tiffany tried to rationalize, of course, like any mind accustomed to seeking solutions. Maybe old pipes, maybe swollen wood, maybe anything but what her intuition screamed. Something wasn't right. Still, she clung to logic. She considered calling an electrician, maybe a plumber or even a janitor. She didn't want to seem fragile or paranoid. After all, she had braved the loneliness of many emotional winters to be here. But deep down, something inside her, perhaps an ancestral memory of survival, whispered wisely, "There are presences that cannot be seen, but can be felt." And that was where empathy with one's own fear should come into play. Not as weakness, but as guidance. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Unexplained sounds, as if someone were walking slowly in the wee hours. Tiffany's breathing became more pent-up each night. Her sleep became more fragile. Her trust in her own reality became more tenuous. It was as if the apartment itself was testing her intelligence, her perspicacity. The experience, which should have been marked by gratitude, humility, and inspiration, now also carried traces of unease, and yet she chose to stay. Maybe it was her stubborn hope. Maybe it was the weight of everything she'd invested. Or maybe, strange as it may seem, she felt she needed to be there for a greater reason. She didn't know what it was yet, but something in that uncertain atmosphere kept her trapped. And it was at that point that she began to realize that life's true adventure isn't always made of grand gestures, but of small details that escape the eye. Like a door that should be closed but finds itself open in the morning, or an object out of place that insists on shifting its position. Then, the enigma intensified, pulling hard on the thread of reality and setting the stage for what was to come. In the following mornings, Tiffany began to notice small details that seemed to defy logic. The kitchen door, which she was sure she had locked before bed, appeared wide open at dawn. The windows, always tightly locked for fear of cold wind or intrusion, appeared ajar as if someone had silently entered or left. At first, she thought it was forgetfulness, some lapse between the tiring routine and the adjustment to her new home. But the episodes became frequent, almost daily. She began to write everything down, recording times, the positions of objects, the locks. The pattern was clear. Something or someone was trying to shatter her confidence. The loneliness of the big city, which had once seemed like a silent blessing, now became a disturbing echo. And even amidst the unease, Tiffany tried to maintain her composure, balancing her emotional intelligence with faith in her own perception. Wisdom required vigilance. Understanding reality required more than logic. It required instinct, self-empathy, and the courage to face the unseen. On one of those strange days, Tiffany noticed that a small vase, which always sat on the living room table, had been moved to the windowsill. It wasn't something that moved on its own, nor was it the kind of thing the wind could knock over or push over. Her first sensation was shock, followed by fear, then a kind of silent indignation. She began testing her own sense of reality. She placed objects in strategic locations and photographed them. When she returned from work, she saw they were out of place. A picture frame turned toward the wall, a book stacked differently, a glass on the sink, when she clearly remembered putting it away. This began to play with her psyche, raising questions about sanity, trust, and boundaries. It was as if the apartment were alive, reacting to her movements, her thoughts. The feeling of being watched grew day by day, pushing her inward, forcing her to seek answers in what cannot be seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. But not everything was fear. There were, even in the face of growing dread, moments when Tiffany tried to transform her uneasiness into initiative. She began to study more about environmental psychology, about how spaces influence emotions. She read authors like Carl Jung, who spoke about the symbols hidden in reality. She researched ancient rituals, forms of spiritual protection and energy cleansing habits. She placed coarse salt in the corners of the house, lavender on her pillow, and lit myrrh incense, not out of superstition, but in an attempt to reconcile herself with that space, with her own mind. She tried to apply simple acts of kindness to her surroundings, such as arranging things more carefully, speaking aloud to affirm her presence, and planting small flowers on the balcony. It was her way of showing respect to the unknown, of asking for understanding from the invisible. And even though each day brought a new fright, Tiffany began to understand that there was a greater enigma there, a mystery that wasn't limited to noises or out-of-place objects, but was directly linked to the story of those who had passed through there before her. In the third week, something or someone entered the scene. It was an upstairs neighbor, whom Tiffany had noticed a few times before, always discreetly, almost invisibly. A tall man with weathered features and a look that vacillated between compassion and suspicion. He didn't say much. He greeted with a brief nod, but his gaze carried a weight as if he wanted to say something he couldn't quite put into words. Tiffany, guided by her emotional intelligence and the kindness she naturally cultivated, tried to strike up a conversation one day in the elevator. He responded with a few words and an enigmatic phrase, "You still have time, but not much." There was no context. There was no explanation. It kept lingering in her mind. Was it a warning or a threat? Was it wisdom or delusion? The line between the two in that building seemed increasingly blurred, and even without understanding, Tiffany sensed a loose thread, something unresolved. That figure could be the key to something she didn't even know was locked. After that, their encounters became frequent, but never comfortable. The man was always there somewhere in the hallway, standing near the stairs, sometimes leaning against the garage wall, as if waiting for something that never arrived. Tiffany began to feel watched, not just by the sounds of the apartment, but by him as well. It was as if his presence was a constant reminder that there were too many secrets in this place, but there was something deeper there. At times, she realized that behind his taciturn appearance, there was a layer of fear, the kind of fear that turns people into living ghosts. This touched her unexpectedly. For a moment, she felt empathy for him. Perhaps he too was trapped in this place. Perhaps his insecurity was older than she imagined. Still, his posture created discomfort. There was something strange about the way he appeared whenever she felt most vulnerable. It was as if he knew the noises, the doors opening, the objects out of place. Tiffany began to wonder, to what extent was he watching her, and why? Over time, that neighbor became almost a mythological figure in her mind. Tiffany began asking discreet questions around the building. Most residents barely knew his name. Some said he'd been there for decades. Others claimed he'd left and returned several times, as if he couldn't leave the building. It all sounded fantastical, but her own reality was no longer entirely solid. Still, something in her refused to judge him hastily. There was wisdom in observing before reacting, and Tiffany had learned with great effort to value attentive listening, humility in the face of the unknown. It wasn't enough to confront impulsively. It took sensitivity to read between the lines. Sometimes, what seems like a threat is just someone asking for help in a devious way. Other times, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. Tiffany wasn't sure what to think, but she decided to maintain a respectful distance, without hostility. She felt she needed to be vigilant, as the messages were starting to appear, and some would come from places as unlikely as the floor of her own apartment. It was a grey Sunday when Tiffany decided to give her apartment a deeper clean. She felt the need to renew her energy, as if every corner of the house bore invisible marks that resisted time and oblivion. She armed herself with a broom, bucket, rag, and determination. She moved furniture, cleaned baseboards, and organized drawers. It was while sweeping the living room rug that she noticed an uneven spot on the floor. A small gap between the wooden planks stood out, like a poorly healed scar. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and courage, Tiffany used a screwdriver to pry the plank free. There, in a cramped, dark space, was something wrapped in an aged cloth. She carefully unrolled it and found yellowed papers, notes with shaky handwriting, as if urgency and desperation had guided every word. In all of them, one phrase repeated with variations, "Don't trust what you see." That brought a silent shock. It was as if the former resident were there, trying to protect someone yet to come. This wasn't just any warning. It was a muffled cry for survival. With each new note, Tiffany felt a mixture of fear and empathy. Some were dated years ago, others seemed more recent, as if the sequence of messages had crossed time, united by an invisible thread of affection and desperation. There were words of pain, of warning, of longing, even of guilt. One said, "Don't trust the walls, they lie." Another, in almost illegible handwriting, said, "What seems human may not be, and what doesn't seem human may just want help." Tiffany felt a chill down her spine. It was as if, finally, all the loose ends were beginning to connect. This touched her humanity deeply. Who had written those notes? Was she still alive? Had she escaped? Or was she now just part of that energy imbued in the walls? The power of kindness manifested itself there, not as something gentle, but as an extreme gesture of someone who, even in fear, thought of others. Tiffany began to carefully store the notes, placing them in a wooden box, as if they were a reliquary of wisdom and pain. It was like holding someone else's hope in her hands. That same day, Tiffany decided to scatter white candles around the house and write her own words, trying to restore to the space some of the light that someone, at some point, had tried to extinguish. She placed one of the most impactful notes in the center of the living room as a reminder that understanding and intelligence could be protective tools as strong as locks or alarms. She began to look at the apartment with new eyes. It wasn't just a physical space, but a field of untold stories, a place that breathed past, presence, and perhaps something beyond. Tiffany, who until then had resisted the idea of something supernatural, began to accept that some answers lie not in books, but in the silence between the noises. She knew she needed to go further. If there were hidden messages, perhaps there were also hidden glances. And suddenly, a detail on the ceiling made her stop. A tiny circular dot, almost imperceptible. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't a crack. It was something much stranger. Tiffany stood paralyzed before the spot on the ceiling. The longer she stared, the more she seemed to make sense of what might previously have gone unnoticed. She grabbed a chair, climbed up carefully, and approached. It was a small round hole with a barely discernible metal rim. There was no dust there, unlike the rest of the ceiling. It was recent, and it wasn't unique. As she looked more closely, she began to notice other similar spots. On the electrical outlets in the corner of the hallway, under a shelf. All discreet, all in strategic locations. It was at that moment that her stomach turned. A wave of fear gripped her. This was more than strange, it was invasive, it was cruel. Tiffany got down from the chair and sat on the floor, panting. She felt exposed, watched, violated. It was as if all her intimacy had been hijacked by invisible eyes. Her mind tried to organize its thoughts, but everything seemed to revolve around a single question. Was someone still watching? The feeling of loneliness now transformed into something much more disturbing. The security that seemed to stem from logic disappeared in the face of the brutality of hidden surveillance. Overcome by a mix of indignation and a need for action, Tiffany decided to investigate further. She went to an electronics store and bought a hidden camera detector. The attendant, surprised by her directness, tried to talk, but she was focused. Returning to her apartment, she ran the device around every corner, and the signals began to pop up like silent alarms of something evil. Behind a mirror frame, inside a living room light fixture, between the cracks of a light switch. There weren't many, but they were enough to shatter any sense of privacy. Tiffany, with a courage that only pain can awaken, began carefully removing each device. In her mind, the values that had always guided her life echoed: honesty, respect, dignity. How could anyone break such basic principles? How could anyone turn a home into a prison without bars? The feeling was profoundly moving. Tiffany wept, silently, not out of weakness but out of empathy for so many people who, perhaps like her, were being watched without knowing it. It went beyond fear. It was a matter of humanity. In the days that followed, Tiffany dedicated herself to understanding how those cameras had been installed. She researched the apartment's history, called a security technician, read online forums, and talked to neighbors. She discovered that the building, though old, had undergone a brief renovation years ago. funded by a landlord no one saw around anymore. The trail of truth seemed hidden behind walls and contracts. But Tiffany was no longer the same woman who had moved in weeks ago. The experience was refining her acumen, expanding her emotional wisdom and sharpening her courage. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by initiative, resilience, and a healthy curiosity. And it was while moving a heavy piece of furniture in the bedroom, in an attempt to rearrange the space and purify the energy, that something unusual happened. A dry creak echoed through the wall, a hollow sound, unlike anything she'd ever heard there. Tiffany knelt on the ground and began to probe with her hands, and what she found there was something no camera could capture. As she moved the heavy piece of furniture away, Tiffany realized that the wall behind it wasn't part of the original plan. The texture was different, the color slightly lighter, as if it had been erected later, hiding something. The hollow sound, revealing an empty space behind it, aroused an instinctive uneasiness in her. She grabbed a flashlight and began tapping it lightly with her knuckles. There was a narrow, almost imperceptible crack, covered with a thin layer of spackle. It was as if someone had wanted to completely erase any trace of what had been there. Driven by a mixture of fear, hope, and an immense desire to understand, Tiffany searched for improvised tools. She used a screwdriver to loosen what she could, and then a hammer to break through. After nearly an hour of effort, dust, and sweat, an opening finally revealed itself, and behind that false wall, a hidden space, a dark, musty-smelling room where light seemed hesitant to penetrate. Her heart raced. She was faced with something many would never have the courage to face. It was there that the truth began to reveal itself. The hidden room was small, but dense. It carried in the air the density of something unresolved. Tiffany entered slowly, eyes alert and flashlight in hand. Cardboard boxes were stacked, some torn by time, an old dresser with jammed drawers, and on a wooden chair a pile of personal objects, faded photographs, children's bracelets, a blue-covered diary. It was as if the space had been frozen in time, a memory capsule storing lives that had passed through it. Opening the diary, Tiffany read pages filled with pain and tenderness. They were accounts of a young woman named Melissa, who described living with strange sounds, unexplained changes in the environment, vivid dreams, and the feeling of being constantly watched. But there were also passages of sweetness, of gratitude, for small moments of peace, for attempts at rebuilding. Tiffany felt an immediate affection for this stranger. It was as if her feelings had penetrated the pages, touching her soul directly. The connection was palpable. The empathy between two women separated by time, yet united by the same space. As she explored further, Tiffany found another box, locked with a small, rusty padlock. With dexterity, she managed to pry it open. Inside, besides personal items, were photos of different people, all smiling in front of the same apartment. Most had dates on the back, some had names, some didn't. But there was a disturbing pattern. All these people, according to records Tiffany would later research, had disappeared. None had left a trace. A pang of emotion gripped her chest. This was no longer a play on imagination. It was real, and it hurt. What had once seemed like an old cheap apartment now revealed itself as the scene of something deep and dark. Tiffany felt a lump in her throat, but also a strength growing within her. Humanity cries out for justice, for respect, for understanding, and in that moment she knew she could no longer back down. She was enveloped in a greater truth, something that mixed fear with mission. But the strangest thing was what would happen. Next, that very night at 3 a.m, Tiffany would hear something that could not be ignored. That night, when absolute silence finally seemed to embrace the apartment, Tiffany woke with a start. It was exactly 3 a.m. The room was dark, but not completely dark. Streetlight filtered in through the barely closed blinds. She lay on her side, her heart racing, a strange sense of presence all around her. And then she heard it, a whisper, right next to her ear, as if someone were there, just inches away. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but clearly articulated. "You're seeing what they want you to see." Tiffany sat up in bed, panicked. She turned on the lamp, looked around. Nothing. The apartment was as usual, but the sensation was real. The sound wasn't coming from outside, nor from a dream. It was with her, and it wasn't just any whisper. It was a voice imbued with affection and fear, as if someone were pleading for attention. The experience left immediate scars, tremors, a cold sweat, and an urgency to understand what or who was trying to communicate. The next day, Tiffany decided to use an old audio recorder she had kept in a drawer. She placed it next to her bed, set to record continuously throughout the night. The following night, again at 3 in the morning, the voices returned. Short whispers, loose phrases, a lament, a plea. But when she checked the tape in the morning, nothing had been recorded. Only the sound of the environment, no voices, no strange noises, as if the mystery mocked her attempt to capture it. Tiffany repeated the process for several nights, switching equipment, trying more sensitive microphones, digital recorders, all in vain. The voices came, left her skin crawling, her heart racing, and then disappeared as if they had never existed. Loneliness, which had previously been a physical state, now took on an existential dimension. It was the feeling of being accompanied by something no one else could hear. And yet, Tiffany didn't give in to despair. Her resilience grew. She knew she needed to interpret those signs. Not just survive the experience, but understand it wisely. Guided by her intuition and the need to protect not only herself, but also the memories of those who had passed through there, Tiffany decided to respond. One night, hearing the whispers, again she spoke softly with respect and honesty. "I'm listening. I'm here. You can trust me." The atmosphere felt lighter for a brief moment. It was as if a small bridge of affection and empathy had been built between two worlds. Tiffany wasn't sure what she was doing, but she knew it came from the most human place within her. And perhaps that was what the apartment was waiting for. Someone who not only felt fear, but also offered love, understanding, and forgiveness. Someone who understood the power of kindness even in the face of the unknown. That moment of connection made her wonder, what if someone is allowing all of this? What if there's something in this apartment's past that has been deliberately hidden? The voices were asking for help, yes, but they were also pointing to something much more concrete. And as she searched for the property's origins, Tiffany would discover that nothing was as simple as it seemed. Unsettled by everything she had experienced in recent weeks, Tiffany felt she needed to go beyond intuition. She needed facts. It was time to confront the history of the place where she lived. Armed with courage and intelligence, she went to the city registry office, determined to search for documents, records, and any clue that could shed light on the origin of the property. The clerk, somewhat surprised by her initiative, pulled out the files and began to reveal an unusual history. The apartment had been registered by different owners over the years, but none of them had lived there for more than 6 months. Some simply disappeared, others left the property with vague excuses, and still others were listed as in dispute, with lawsuits never concluded. Tiffany, with a mixture of insight and indignation, felt the ground shake. Why wasn't anyone telling her this part? Why was the rent so far below market value? It was as if there was a conspiracy of silence, fueled by opaque contracts and faceless signatures. She decided to visit the real estate agent who had brokered the rental. With a firm stance and a resolute voice, she requested access to the original lease and the previous tenant's information. The employee hesitated, evaded the question and asked her to come back another day. But Tiffany didn't back down. Her sense of justice, her emotional intelligence, and her empathy for all the forgotten stories she had uncovered there pushed her forward. After insistence, she gained access to part of the files, and it was there that something disturbing emerged. Several names were in the system, but there were erasures, dates that didn't match, and at least 3 tenants whose whereabouts were unknown. One of them, in fact, was the name of one of the people in the photos she had found in the secret room. The commotion was immediate. This was no coincidence. Tiffany felt she now carried a responsibility that transcended her own safety. It was as if she had been chosen by chance or fate to resolve something that had long been swept under the rug. But who was allowing all this to continue? Seeking more clarity, Tiffany scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney. During the meeting, she shared everything she had found: notes, photos, cameras, documents, and even audio recordings. Tiffany was visibly shaken. She said the property's history raised serious suspicions and that the real estate agency's negligence could constitute a crime. But what struck her most was the coldness with which everything had been covered up. It was as if someone was determined to maintain that cycle. Tiffany felt the spiral of mystery tighten. She was dealing with forces that blended the human and the invisible. Fear was still present, but the hope for justice was beginning to take hold like a mission. Returning home that day, she passed the concierge and crossed paths with her enigmatic neighbor again, who simply watched her with sad eyes. "You figured it out, didn't you?" he murmured, and for the first time she smiled. Tiffany, with a lump in her throat, understood that she was getting closer and closer to the choice that would change everything. Returning to her apartment that night, Tiffany felt the air thicken. It wasn't just the temperature or the unsettling silence. It was the energy of the place, as if the space itself knew something important was about to happen. She sat on the edge of her bed, took a deep breath, and reflected. She had reached a point where it was no longer possible to ignore the truth, nor to pretend it was all a coincidence. She was at a crossroads between 2 equally intense paths. She could pack her things, walk out the door, and never look back. Leave the mystery, the voices, the signs, and everything she had discovered buried within the walls of that building. It would be an act of self-preservation, yes, but also a form of abandonment. And Tiffany wasn't made of that. Her life had always been marked by silent struggles, by internal battles won with resilience, empathy, humility, and initiative. She knew that running away was denying the journey of overcoming she had embarked on thus far. It meant erasing the history not only of herself, but of all those left behind. But the other path, oh, that was even more challenging. Staying meant facing the unknown, accepting that her peace would be constantly tested, that fear and insecurity could accompany her night after night. It required a courage that transcended the physical. It was the courage to look at pain without looking away. Tiffany knew that by staying, she would risk not only her sanity, but perhaps even her life. Yet she also understood that certain truths need to be illuminated, and that sometimes the price of justice is paid by those with the emotional strength to bear the weight of truth. Therein lay the essence of humanity, sacrificing comfort for the greater good, transforming emotion into action, and making pain itself a catalyst for change. And as she walked through the room, touching the cold walls with her fingers, she felt that each step was also a silent pact. Her choice was no longer about a cheap property, but about the value of conscience, integrity, hope, and love for others, even if those others were no longer here. Tiffany spent the night awake, staring at the door to the secret room. Inside, there were still unexamined objects, pieces of a story that had withstood the test of time. The choice she had to make wasn't just about staying or leaving, but about who she wanted to be from then on. A woman who left behind a truth because it hurt too much, or someone who dared to face the unknown in the name of compassion, justice, and truth. In the darkness, she hugged an old coat, lay down on the couch, and dozed for a few minutes. Then she heard something. Not a whisper, not a knock, it was breathing, slow, deep, and it wasn't her own. That presence that had accompanied her from the beginning was there, clearer than ever, and this time Tiffany didn't hide. She got up, followed the sound, and opened the door to the hidden room. What she saw inside, finally, would not only reveal the origin of all events, but would radically change her view of what is real, what is human, and what is capable of loving or destroying in silence. Dawn light filtered through the curtains as Tiffany entered the hidden room with slow steps and watchful eyes. Her breathing still echoed in the room, but now she couldn't tell if it was real, spiritual, or a reflection of her own mind. She felt like all of this was bringing her to a breaking point, between logic and the inexplicable, between pain and redemption, between fear and enlightenment. That's when she noticed a false panel on one of the walls, different from the others. Removing it, she found not only hidden wires and electronics, but a monitor switched on, static, pulsing like a digital heart. Beside it, old tapes, many labeled with dates, names, and strange codes. Tiffany trembled. There were records of people, intimate records, and behind them, a familiar name, one of the former owners, who also appeared in the investigation as someone involved in a clandestine surveillance network. That crushing truth fell like an avalanche. The supernatural was real, but even more real was human cruelty. The callousness with which someone chose to transform the homes of so many into a theater of pain. Tiffany realized something terrible. The entire building had been used for years as an experiment, an observation field, not just for sick entertainment, but perhaps for psychological study, control, manipulation. The voices? They could have been echoes of real people, trapped, terrified, lost. Or perhaps they were fragments of their presence, still wandering there, crying out for justice. The revelation cut deep. The presence she sensed wasn't necessarily an evil entity, but perhaps a soul in pain, seeking not revenge, but understanding, forgiveness, reconciliation. Tiffany fell to her knees in tears. The emotion was so great that her body trembled, but there in the midst of the pain, she also found love. Love for the truth, love for those who had been silenced, love for the courage to continue. It was a raw wisdom, difficult to bear but necessary. She finally understood that her greatest strength wasn't the will to flee, but the ability to stay and transform, to break the cycle. To be the last piece of a puzzle that for decades had been crying out for someone with the courage to see beyond the walls. In the following days, Tiffany called the police, handed over the evidence, and exposed the truth. The case shocked the community. Headlines filled with revelations. The building was sealed off, investigations multiplied, and in the midst of it all, she came to be seen as an unlikely heroine. But what few knew was the emotional toll it had taken. Her peace, her innocence, her worldview, still she stood firm, because true courage lies not in the absence of fear, but in the decision to act despite it. Tiffany understood that this was more than a dark story. It was a reminder that understanding, intelligence, altruism, and the power of kindness are beacons that must shine even in the darkest places, that even the most silent of victims deserves a voice, that resilience is a form of love, and that ultimately the most powerful force is not the fear that paralyzes, but the inspiration that liberates. The apartment was now empty, but Tiffany's soul would never be again. She had become something rare, a keeper of truth in silent times. And now that you've come this far, stop for a moment. Take a deep breath. Ask yourself, how many times have you ignored signs because they seemed silly? How many times did your intuition try to speak, but you silenced it with logic? Tiffany's story isn't just about a haunted apartment. It's about choices. About how many times in life you have to decide between the fear that paralyzes and the courage that transforms. How many doors have you left closed for fear of what you might find behind them? What if, precisely behind those doors, lie the answers you've been searching for years? Are you living in an emotional environment where everything seems safe, but deep down something is wrong? Do you feel like you're being watched, judged, or manipulated by invisible forces? Perhaps not by cameras, but by expectations, by old traumas, by voices from the past that still whisper when you lay your head on the pillow. This story serves as a mirror to show that everyone carries a secret room inside. The question is, do you have the courage to open that door? Because sometimes opening up is more liberating than continuing to pretend it doesn't exist. If this story touched you, if it awakened something deep inside, perhaps fear, perhaps courage, perhaps a spark of hope, then do something for yourself. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey with us. Because here, each story is an invitation to reconnect with your own truth. And remember, the greatest monster is the one we pretend isn't there. But the good news is that you were never truly alone. Courage begins when you decide to look it in the eye, and it's already there, inside you.